Great. Thank you so much, Roy, for coming, and thank you, Katrina, for coming to speak about your book. We just heard the dates in the titles of your previous two books, kind of early 19th century, late 18th century. This book is a little bit of a departure from that in terms of kind of addressing issues in the whole period since and up to the present day. I was wondering kind of what inspired you to move in that direction, what lays behind this book?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks everyone for coming. So to start off, inspirations for this book, I started in about 2018, and when you said you were going to ask me this question, I looked back at my notes from that and I thought, well, where did I start from? And I started from an essay by Doreen Massey, the radical geographer, and it's not one of her books, it's one of the, it's basically a big blog post essay called Landscape, Space, Politics. And it came out of an HRC project which was looking at landscape. Obviously she's a geographer, but looking at the Robinson in Ruins film by Patrick Keller. And it's worth a read if it's still available online. It's quite a hard read if you don't do theory, but we're in a place where I think people are quite familiar with Deleuze or Polanyi, and Polanyi sort of haunts me. I'm half expecting his book to kind of pop out like a poltergeist from behind me. I'm in front of the economics. So I started off with this essay, which is about the film goes to Thatcham in Oxfordshire and looks at the landscape, which is highly militarised, but it also has resonances back to the 1830s and the swing riots and the Speenhamland system. So I'm a 19th century historian, had done a lot on the early 19th century, so the swing riots, the agricultural versions of the Luddites, and in the essay, she talks a lot about enclosure and the value of looking at local spaces and the long history of looking at local spaces. And she was kind of in an argument at the time with David Harvey, the Marxist theorist, who argued that if you're looking at local spaces, you're being too inward looking, you're being too insular. And Massey's argument was, and wonderful quote, which I quote a lot everywhere that I go, she was looking at the battles over this particular site, both backwards in history and then forwards. And she said it's not about local protectionism, but a critique of dispossession. So that word dispossession caught me. And so I thought, well, why don't I do a longer history? I'm used to doing stuff about the early 19th century. Why don't I look at forwards and backwards? And this idea of dispossession, enclosure, some of the big themes of the book, which are about the landscape and who's fenced it off, who protects it, who challenges it over the long period. So I started thinking about, well, what about these particular landscapes that have been enclosed and continue to be contested? And it was also at the time that there was quite a lot of debate about the privatisation of public space, which comes from America. There's a lot of American debate around shopping centres and shopping streets being privatised. And then that came to kind of the UK with Owen Hadley's work, Lindsay Hanley's writing about council estates as well. So this is all kind of 2010 stuff. And that got me thinking about urban space as well. Can urban space be enclosed? And finally, a bit more recently, Brett Christopher's work on the new enclosures. So there's my intellectual trajectory. It got me from Massey to kind of Hatherley to Brett Christopher's. I'm sure you can buy all those works here. Please do. Please support the bookshop. So thinking about enclosure as a metaphor, but also as a physical way of understanding what's happened to public space since then. So that's a really roundabout way of saying what's inspired me to write the book, but that's where I've got to. And interestingly, actually reading that this morning, I think I need to revisit this essay again in the light of what's happened since 2018. We're in a completely different world, I think, geopolitically now. So where do those conversations that were being had in the 2010s, how do I move forward? I don't have an answer to that, so don't ask it in the questions. But that's something I probably end up thinking about a bit more now that you've prompted me to ask about where did I come from.
It's a great essay. I think I actually first came across it as a link on your website. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's brilliant. But in terms of coming to write about the recent past, how different does that feel? Was that kind of like a process of adaptation? Did it feel like a big adjustment, or?
Yeah. So I'm a historian. I've been trained traditionally as a historian. Historians like to carve out their periods and write. I'm looking at someone who just writes about one particular year in time. I'm only joking, Robert. Two periods. But historians tend to be quite protective over their periods. So I'm classified as an early 19th centuryist. And if you delve into other periods, you're seen as a bit of a dilettante. Whereas it's really normal in geography to do cross chronologies. So I take my inspiration again more from the historical geographers who look at different periods through the same lenses. So it has been a kind of interesting shift to look at the 20th century, 21st century, whereas, most of my early 19th century characters are all dead, so I don't really need to worry about them in terms of ethics or what they might say about me. But now, when you're dealing with 68 onwards, it's a bit more, you've got to be more careful. So I deliberately didn't interview anyone for this book. I relied on printed material or published interviews because I'm not really that kind of historian. But I was trying to kind of think about the 20th century from a perspective of a 19th centuryist, but there are differences. Like I didn't have to look up who the politicians were in the 1980s because I remember those names. I know who they are. So I was looking at the Stonehenge case where in 1996 there were the two campaigners who were arrested for trespass on Stonehenge in the 10th anniversary of the Battle of the Beanfield. And they were defended by Keir Starmer in court. So you're looking at letters written by Keir Starmer in his legal barrister days. So it's kind of interesting that you're kind of familiar with these characters at the time. So hopefully I'm not treading on too many 20th century toes like yourself in terms of looking at that. But I think it's important to look at that longue durée because I was interested in those layers of time in a particular place. What is before, what's now, what's been in between, and looking at that kind of long history of a place and particular places that I think are quite resonant.
There is always that fear that your subjects will come to the book talk.
Yeah.
You also talk about, for example, attending the 2003 protest and kind of reflecting on the spaces there.
Hyde Park turns up a lot because Hyde Park becomes that kind of national protest site. My main memory of the anti-Iraq war marches, some of the people who I was with here, I was with the East Oxford group, and we got the big march. We got there quite early because I think there were a lot of elderly people who were concerned about the toilet issue, which is very important as a logistical thing. You didn't want to be stuck at Embankment. So we ended up getting to Hyde Park quite early. So we got near the stage quite early, and I remember the crowds kind of filtering in and filling up the natural amphitheatre there's kind of a bit of a dip where the stage was, and that's my main memory of that. And I'm always interested in that kind of landscape of of how protest spaces work for crowds or not.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the kind of taking influence from geography, it's kind of reflected in the structure of the book itself, right? Like the chapters are organised not primarily chronologically, but in terms of spaces like pavements and railings and commons and wastes and stuff. What sort of drove that decision, and to what extent is there still a chronology running through the book?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read it, I won't be testing people on if they have read it. The first part of the book, as you've said, is focused on more rural spaces. So it starts with the commons, it looks at waste, which is the kind of counterpart to commons, and it looks at verges, sort of roadside verges. And I think that's because that earlier period of protest is about rural spaces. So it's about resistance to enclosure, it's about the right to roam, it's about footpaths and preservation, it's about the verges chapters about Gypsy Roma traveller communities being pushed off the land. So a lot of that, I think, chronologically makes sense to organise that as a rural types of protest, or protest in rural spaces. And then it moves on into the later 19th century, which is about pavements, public parks and barricades, I call it, which is about the fights over street space, because the 19th century becomes the time when there's new types of public space in urban areas. So public parks essentially are Victorian inventions. Trafalgar Square really only kicks off about 1840s, 44. Hyde Park, obviously, you don't have political meetings there until the Reform League pulled down the railings in 1866. So those middle chapters are about those battles in towns or cities. And then the last couple of chapters are about the 20th century. So I have a chapter on kind of the new social movements of the post-war era, and then go into the 80s and 90s. And I think those spaces around that period when public spaces mostly publicly owned. So we see nationalisation of industry and also mass council housing, mass council ownership. But that's actually quite a small period of England and Wales history. And that's also why I wanted to do this kind of longue durée book, because I think a lot of those histories that came out in the 2010s that were about council housing in particular, I'm thinking about Lindsay Handley's work, to some extent Owen Hadley's work, kind of started to be quite nostalgic about the mid-century era of public ownership, harking back to that era because things are becoming privatised again. And I just wanted to remind people that that's actually quite a small period of time comparatively, that everything in Britain, certainly England and Wales, is about private property. And it only really becomes public between about 1919, with the start of council housing, and 1979. And so that's 60 years. And then what happens either side of that? It's the dominance of private property. Please disagree, but I think that's why I wanted to focus on that towards the end of the book, that it's about the kind of rise and fall of common public land. So the last part of the book's about going back to the commons. So it's about new travellers, peace campaigners, environmental campaigners going back to commons, be it Castle Morton in 92 or the Battle of Beanfield. It's all about urban people being in rural spaces again. So it kind of comes full circle. Yeah,
I think that links to me to another major theme of the book, which is the idea that maybe some kind of historians or social scientists or whatever have focused on control of space by authority, by the government, by corporations. But you really try and put emphasis and draw attention back to the kinds of resistance or commoning that is done alongside or against that. in terms of kind of turning points, how would you see the balance between that? Are there kind of real big shifts in the types of protests which people are participating in?
Yeah, it depends on how you look at it. Now I'm becoming the historian again, aren't I? In terms of shifts, I think from a protest history perspective, hopefully the historians in this room will agree with me, the 1790s are the first big shift in that ordinary working class urban people have been involved in large scale protests that are about politics. And here's the Thompsonian in me coming in, the making in the English working class. I do think that that first democracy movement from the 1790s through to Peterloo, through to the Chartists, I think that's the kind of big shift for me in terms of how protesting as a kind of political campaign, political movements are organised. So prior to that, you do get large meetings in fields or on squares, but they're mainly about elections. And generally, although there's debate about to what extent working class people have their say in that, certainly they're not sort of having their own separate voice mostly, whereas from the 1790s onwards, you get that sort of democratic movement becoming much more popular in that standard format of a protest, demonstration, which is the mass platform. Someone on a stage with, well, not a megaphone in the 1790s, but and people singing, banners, massive loads of people, the standard things that we still see in demonstrations, that marches go into a field. All that really takes off in the 1790s. In London, you know, the big London Corresponding Society meetings in the 1790s then moves up north in the 18 teens. So I think that's a real key turning point. The other key turning point from the state's perspective is probably 1829 with the new police in London, the Met Police. And I think policing changes a lot of things. Whereas before you're reliant on a magistracy who may or may not be effective and have to call in the troops or call up special constables. From the Met Police and then County Police from 1839, you've got much more of a kind of crowd control situation that's a lot more about preventative policing, crowd control that's a more regular, a lot more negotiation between where you can hold protests and why. So I think those two things then shape the rest of the 19th century. If we go into the 20th century, I think it's more to do with legislation. I think it's more to do with the public order legislation, 36 and 86. I'll be testing you later if you're on your exam about when all these dates are. But those two public order acts, I think, are again sort of shaping how protest is policed as well as kind of made it as a kind of problem, if you like, you know, in a different way than it had been in the 19th century. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I think so, yeah. I think when you're talking about policing, about the kind of examples of where it's not just this law has changed, this is the way that protests are now policed, but that there's kind of quite significant police discretion in the way that, you know, specific forces or specific commanders or whatever are implementing the legislation.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe specifically with reference to the kind of present and public order legislation today, and how far there might be opportunities to kind of exist in those like gaps between the law and its implementation.
Yeah. I think the story is one of the Met Police versus everyone else. I think the Met Police have got a different story from the other constabularies. And I think my impression, again, I'm not a historian of policing, but my impression is it's very variegated according to the different county constabularies in how they deal with public order. The Met Police seem to be the fiercest throughout history. So I talk a bit about Sir Charles Warren in the 1880s. He's come over from like the Boer War and the colonies, and I think the colonial context of a lot of these Met Police commanders is really important. That they've been enforcing law in India or in South Africa, and then come here, and so Charles Warren, he's bans all the meetings in Trafalgar Square in 1886. It leads to what's called Bloody Sunday in 1887, which is an attack basically on the police on unemployed protesters in Trafalgar Square. And he's criticised quite heavily for very militarised policing, whereas before the Met Police are supposed to be they're not supposed to be gendarmes. You know, what we're British, we're not French, which is the kind of message of the entire history of Britain, I think. Whereas I think, you know, and that it kind of repeats itself every generation, the kind of harshness of Met Police commissioners, in a way that I think is slightly different in the other county constabularies. So to come back to your question about the current legislation, public order legislation I find is always quite reactive to particular movements. So it gets passed because there's a kind of campaign against particular groups. So it might be, you know, it was the fascists in 1936. It was kind of miners and football hooligans in 86. New Travellers and Ravers in 94. The most recent ones, it is against the environmental protesters, Just Stop Oil, and I think it's reflected in specific clauses in those legislation against particular tactics, like locking on and things that are associated with those particular groups. But then it gets used for much larger, you know, it can spread more widely because it's a general public order act, even though it's aimed at particular, whoever the bête noire of public order is at the time. So I don't know enough about all the other, how policing works in other counties, but I suspect it depends what county you're in, how much kind of leeway you've got with how you're policed at demonstrations, and it requires a negotiation, I think, with the authorities.
I am thinking back to being a teenager and being involved in protests in my kind of small town, and I think that the local police force sort of didn't know what was going on. They'd not had one before, you know. I'm glad that you mentioned the kind of colonial context for that policing, because I thought that was maybe a feature of the book that is indicative of it being written kind of in the present and that awareness. I was also thinking about that in relation to, although there are lots of positive stories told about the commons and commoning, you're also quite attentive to the maybe exclusions which the myth of the commons could support. And I was wondering if you could sort of tell us something about that historically, but maybe also whether there are any kind of exclusions which commoning could imply today.
Yeah. Part of this book was kind of a conversation with the kind of Right to Roam and Open Spaces Society. And I will say here, I was an Open Spaces Society fellow, so I've got to be careful what I say here, but part of the book is about how actually the people who ran with that idea of the commons they were still very much about preserving it for the kind of nice middle class activities that everyone likes to do. So the Commons Preservation Society, I've got another expert in the room who knows all about this, but were sort of set up by very nice middle class to upper class people who wanted to preserve the commons for the good of all. But actually in doing that, there's a kind of sense of exclusion of various activities. It's the same with parks as well, that are highly regulated. You know, parks are meant to be for everyone, but you know, they're shut up at night. You can't do everything in a park. And I argue actually parks are probably the most regulated spaces in urban areas. So there's a section on kind of how groups try to kind of subvert that. So there is a kind of radical land tradition in Britain which tries to say that land is for everyone, but I think it's quite weak. There's certain times when it becomes kind of quite a loud voice. I'm obsessed with the character of John de Morgan, who's a Victorian land campaigner, who kind of bridges the kind of radical tradition with the kind of nice middle class societies. So he pops up at all the enclosure riots everywhere. So he's there at Hackney Marshes when they're kind of pulling down the fences there, and then he goes to Leeds and pulls down fences there. And he spouts the kind of language of land nationalisation. But that's actually quite a minority movement, and most people, just want to preserve the spaces for a nice day out. So I don't think this is a commoning isn't the language of land nationalisation or radical ideas about land. It's about using it in different ways. So who gets round it? There's a section in the book on parks on queer spaces and how actually, I've borrowed a lot from Matt Holbrook's book on Queer London here, so it's not my own research, but he talks about how they kind of subvert the kind of norms of public and private space in parks and create their own spaces around urinals. And I found that actually when I was looking at, there's a lovely series of maps in London Archives of where you can hold public meetings in parks, and again it's highly spatialised. So the LCC decide where you can hold a public meeting, and I found that they end up being in the same spaces as the urinals that Matt Holbrook found were the kind of meeting spaces for gay and queer culture and sex workers, who were trying to subvert that kind of in plain sight, what is public, what is private. So there are ways of getting round the kind of restrictions. I think people can be quite clever in doing that. And, who decides who is the public in public space? That was one of my questions that I've been asking all the way through. And a lot of the protest is about kind of claiming to be the public when you're excluded from public space.
I think there's an interesting flip side to me, which is that there's a kind of demand for public space, but there is also sometimes a demand for private space, like cottaging, access to public toilets is a use of public space, but in a sense it's also a privatizing. How do these things is there a parallel history, or is this the same history?
Yeah, it's a parallel history, I think. It's I didn't want to look at private spaces or spaces that are closed off, although I think the chapter on barricades, I was trying to play around with the kind of ideas around building up barricades to defend different communities or different spaces. And again, it's something that's in the Massey essay. I might as well just quote her. Where to put it? No, I can't find it now. But she talks about how you can't fully have public space because it's always striated, is the word that she uses, because she was a geographer. But there's always barriers. There's always people defending their own spaces. So you can't really have a fully public space because people always put up their own barriers to defend that. Sorry, that's quite an abstract answer.
It was quite an abstract question, to be honest. Sorry, because you mentioned John de Morgan, it reminded me that there's a bit in the book where you say you don't want to name too many heroes and villains. But I feel like there may be a few more heroes and villains that you might want to mention, so I wondered if there were any individuals that you wanted to name.
Yeah, John de Morgan is great. If he wrote a pamphlet called Who is John de Morgan? And then didn't answer his own question. So it's worth, if you want to find out about John de Morgan, the land campaigner, do read the Who is John de Morgan. In the section on verges, I talk about Surrey, because I live in Croydon. I mean, we're representing Croydon here on the stage. So we go on a lot of walks, myself and my partner, to round Surrey and Surrey Hills, and everywhere you see Onslow. And when I went to Surrey History Centre, the archives, I said, I'm doing stuff on Gypsy Roma traveller communities in Surrey. And they were, you want to see the Onslow stuff then, won't you? And so I'm really scared that I'm going to get sued by the Onslow family. So Lord Onslow in the early 19th century and mid-19th century is on a mission to exclude all sort of nomadic people from the whole of Surrey. But then he's kind of he's the ancestor of later Onslows who then are in Parliament trying to pass various legislation against gypsies in the 1980s, which end up feeding into the Criminal Justice Bill. So the Onslows are this kind of thread through the family, the kind of enemies of a lot of the characters that I'm talking about. But the earlier Lord Onslow in the 1880s, I think it is, he comes into battle with a Captain Sant, who's not an imaginary character. He's the chief constable of Surrey Constabulary. And bear in mind what I've just said about the police and constabularies. He's a goodie in that he's trying to enforce the law against the Onslow family and also the Bray family in Surrey. Against him, basically the Onslow sends his bailiffs round to beat up gypsies on the Surrey verges. So Sant's there saying you can't do that. Let's stick to the law. Let's not have breaches of peace. And he gets in trouble with the Home Office. So there's a whole kind of story in the book about aristocrats and lower gentry trying to get the government on their side about their own kind of local matters and about policing. And more broadly, it's about the kind of dominance of that kind of gentry class in places like the Surrey Hills, where they do still have a lot of control over land ownership, tenancies and that kind of thing, against the law, which I'm not trying to portray that in this book that we're in an autocratic state. Actually, a lot of the people who are involved in law enforcement are actually just trying to uphold the law. We're not in kind of a dictatorship here. We are sort of a lot of fair people. So the battle between Captain Sant and the Onslow family is kind of a bit of a kind of, I don't know if you could kind of dramatise it, but it's kind of that's kind of one of the themes of the heroes and villains of the books.
It's always a relief when it's not me mentioning Croydon for the first time. That does make me think, though, of the kind of like 1961 CND sit-down protests, which get mentioned, and Croydon's one of the places where they happen. And a lot of the book is about maybe slightly more explicit efforts at commoning or attempts to kind of shape public space, demanding parks or the right to roam or kind of the roads protests. But then there are also a lot of examples of things like CND sit-down demonstrations where they are engaged in challenging, trying to use public space differently because they are protests and protests happen in public space. What's the balance between those, the more explicit efforts at commoning versus protests which are maybe doing it by kind of accident or not so consciously?
Yeah, I think you've picked on a kind of interesting critique here. I'm glad you raised that some of the protests aren't about public space, really. They're about challenging bigger authority or whatever the politics is. So I think you're right in terms of sometimes it just happens to be that's the space they are protesting against. But I do go back to the idea about why I chose commoning as a kind of way of understanding what protest is, in that I've just done a podcast with Open City about the 1961-68 demos in front of the American Embassy. Be out in April. You've got to wait for it. And there they asked a similar question, actually, about is it about the Grosvenor Square or is it about the American Embassy, or what are they actually protesting about? And I think those kind of 1960s movements, going back to Massey again, a connecting, very local space with the wider kind of global peace movement and social movement. So they're obviously protesting in Grosvenor Square because the American embassy's there, but it's also highly symbolic that they're protesting against this big building that's been imposed. It's a new building with it's now a hotel, but it's still got the big eagle in front of it. It's like, I found out for the Open City people, it's 36-foot wingspan of this eagle, American eagle. So even if, even though they're not actually protesting about the public space itself, and Grosvenor Square, they tear down the railings to get into the square. That's partly just because of the space. They need to get more space. But it becomes symbolic of American intrusion, imperialism, all those kind of symbolic features that previous embassies hadn't had, because previous embassies had been just in a Victorian building that looked like every other Victorian building. So I think even in the spaces where they're not actually claiming the space, I think it's useful to think about commoning and public space as a kind of mechanism. All those 1960s protests, the main type of protest is the sit down, that you sit down and don't move until the police lift you up while you're limply, and then the press take a picture of you. And it's very public because you want to get into the newspaper, so you want to get on the rolling news. So I think, so you might pick out some of the examples in the book that are not specifically about claiming that particular space, but in the moment of protest, I think it's important that they're outside, they're accessible, they're in spaces that at that moment they are claiming to be the public, or at least public voice of some sort.
I also think that there are examples where similar types of protest have brought the questions more open, more kind of openly, more explicitly. So, for example, I wouldn't say that the CND sit-down protests were directly saying about it, but Greenham Common and the peace camps probably were making more direct claims about public space.
Yeah. Specifically about the commons. I mean, the Greenham women purchased common rights in order to claim part of the common, which I think is quite a fun tactic as well. So, yeah.
And I guess a final thing, maybe reflecting on where you see yourself in relation to these kind of movements. And at one point you talk about, I think it's the Rhodes protests, where there is an implicit reference to anti-enclosure protests in the Victorian period, but no one's maybe aware of it. But they do directly refer to 1968 and to situationism.
Yeah.
Are you hoping that maybe people will be more aware of that longer history and that might shape protest movements in the present?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian, it's my job. Yeah, no, definitely. I think the more informed and more educated movements are about histories, then the better, really, so that they don't kind of, make the same mistakes, or at least, have that. Successful movements quite often claim a sort of longer legacy. The Chartists claimed a longer legacy backwards. So, and I think fixing in space is really important as well, in place. That quite often what connects people is actually just their local spaces. And that, again, it's kind of going back to that local to global thing, that you're much more likely to get involved in a movement if you can sort of be part of something in your local area. And a lot of successful movements are organised locally first, or at least they connect with things. I can see Richard from Kennington here, and there's Kennington people. I can see Will as well. A lot of the books about Kennington Common, partly because I spent quite a lot of time there in 2018, and what we found, Richard might disagree, what we found at the commemorations of the Chartist movement there was that local people had no idea about the Chartist history, and actually were really interested in it. Once they said, oh, actually this park where I walk my dog, or I take my kids to play on the swings, actually it has this interesting radical history. Actually, that's quite interesting to me, and it makes me feel a bit more part of that community. I think that's really important. So even if it's not necessarily about protest, it might just be about people's connection with where they live, and that it's not necessarily a nationalist history or a right-wing history. It's a radical history that's a bit less in the press or less in the curriculum at school. I think that's all to the good, really.
You've already inspired me to take a group of students to Kennington Common at the first opportunity.
It's a park now.
It's in the calendar. I think that's all of my questions. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can throw it open to the floor.
Thank you.
Did you want to do groups?